Welcome everyone. My name is Kristi Arzola and I release a real-time watercolor tutorial every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Denver time. Today I'm in the mood to paint a simple landscape full of texture and fall color, just to kind of switch it up a little bit, and it helps me relax, and I hope you guys enjoy it. These are the materials that I'll be using in today's watercolor tutorial. You are welcome to pause the video and refer to the video description for an actual list of these materials. But once you become familiar with my tutorials, you'll find I often use the same thing each week. These are the colors I'll be using in today's landscape. You do not need these exact colors, but if you do wish to work with the same colors as myself, pause the video and refer to the video description for a list. I'm working with Cadmium Yellow, Cadmium Orange, Cadmium Red, Cerulean Blue, Ultramarine, Sap Green, and Payne's Gray. Also in the video description is a line drawing as well as a reference photo that you can download and print at home. The line drawing is for those of you who do not feel comfortable sketching out the landscape. I just want you to print the line drawing at the scale you plan on doing the painting. Keep in mind, painting larger can oftentimes be much easier than painting smaller. But considering my time constraints this week, I have to go with a small 5x7, so that's why I'm working on a smaller scale. Once you've printed your line drawing at the scale you wish to paint it, just apply graphite behind the line drawing and then tape it in position so the graphite is touching the top surface of your watercolor paper. Once you've done that, you can trace the entire line drawing with a ballpoint pen. Notice that I selectively decided not to trace all of the branches. I often find that I want to kind of freehand my branches and I don't want to feel restricted to where there's pencil lines. So that's why I was kind of minimal. But since I've traced this essentially in advance, I'm all set to go. So if you need time to transfer your line drawing and print your materials, just pause the video. So I'm going to go ahead and begin mixing up a range of fall colors to use in the foreground of this landscape. I'm going to get my large number 10 round, and I'm going to use it to bring water over to multiple areas of my paint palette so I can mix multiple colors before I begin. One of the colors I'm going to be using is a cadmium yellow, but I want this cadmium yellow to be really vibrant, so I'm going to water it down. Anytime I feel like my paint color might be the right value, then I just take a scrap piece of watercolor paper and test it out. I want to keep in mind that my paint colors will dry to be about 20% lighter than what they appear when they're wet. So if I need it darker, I add more paint. If I need it lighter, I add more water. After my cadmium yellow is ready to go, I'm going to mix up some cadmium orange. And I'm going to have a couple different variations of cadmium orange. So I'm going to put cadmium orange in a couple sections of my palette. So one cadmium orange I will probably use primarily on its own, but I do want the color to be just a smidge more on the earthy side. I don't want it to be super vibrant. So I'm going to choose to add just the tiniest bit of a cerulean blue to my cadmium orange so that my cadmium orange is a little bit more of a natural orange. The second orange, I'm actually going to mix up a little bit of cadmium red to it. I want it to be just a darker, more orange red. So far, those are my three colors that I'm using. And I am going to go an additional route, and I'm going to mix up some browns and greens as well. So I'm just using my number 10 round to bring some clean water over to a couple other areas of my palette. So the green I'm going to start off with is a sap green. I'm going to use quite a bit of pigment because I want to get the color as dark as I can. And then the second mixture is going to be a little bit more of a brown, but I'm going to still use in order to make my brown, I'm going to use Sap Green and Cadmium Red. Now the reason I'm choosing to mix my brown is just so that the colors have color harmony. So I'm kind of using a limited palette for this particular painting. And if I want to, I can add just a little bit of blue to darken it up. But right now, this is my brown. It's just Cadmium Red and Sap Green mixed together. It's a nice warm brown. And right now my Sap Green is really vibrant. I'm going to add just the tiniest bit of Cadmium Red to it so it's more of an olive green. Just add a very small increments of red until you get to that olive green so it doesn't go straight to brown or you'll have to start over. And then lastly, I'm going to make a green that's darker still with added blue. So I'm starting with a sap green base. And I know mixing colors in advance is not everyone's cup of tea, but I like, once I'm in the middle of the painting, I don't want to have to keep stopping and mixing my colors. So I kind of like to determine my color palette in advance. So I'm using sap green with added ultramarine blue. And I'm going to get just the tiniest bit of red so it's a little bit more warm. I'm going to test out that color. And I think that should work. There will be other blues and everything that I will be adding a little later, but right now I just want to kind of get the foreground established. So before I begin painting, I want to be mindful of the lines from my transfer. If there's any lines that are in areas where maybe I'm going to have some lighter color, I want to lighten up those lines by using a kneaded eraser. That way those lines don't show through my paint as easily. So I'm just kind of tapping my brush. Okay, now the colors that are over by my tree, I'm not worried so much about because I'll be using some darker browns in those areas. So I'm going to start off with just painting wet on dry. Okay, so I'm going to get some of my cadmium yellow and I'm going to start off by just painting some texture on the top of my tree here. I'm only going about halfway up into the sky for this first tree because it's further away. And then behind it, I'd like to imply that there's a second tree in the distance, so it's even shorter still. I'm also going to be adding some of this yellow on this tree here to my left. But this tree being in the foreground is going to appear much taller, so I'm going to bring that yellow right up to the very top of my painting. So now that I've kind of established where it is I want my tree heights to be, I'm going to rinse my brush and drag my brush across the rim of my water cup. And I'm just going to use this damp brush to kind of push and pull some of these paint colors around so I have just different variations and values. Now by adding just a little bit of clean water, I'm able to kind of soften some of these edges, get a different texture. And it's also going to ensure that maybe the surface of my paper in some of these areas of the trees stays wet long enough to get in some other colors into my trees. So while things are still wet, I'm now going to move on to that cadmium orange that I added a little bit of blue to. And I just want to get a little bit more orange established in my tree. So I'm working on this foreground tree here. I'm also going to add a little bit of this earthy orange to the left side of the second tree. I'm okay with leaving some of that negative space, so I'm not putting a lot of pressure on myself to fill everything in. I also want to add just a hint of some of that orange to the rear tree that's off in the distance. So I'm now going to rinse my brush. I'm going to tap my sponge to get rid of just the larger droplets of water. But I'm going to use this damp brush to kind of push and pull this color around on the surface. So this foreground tree, I want the leaves and foliage to look much thicker. So I'm kind of filling in some of my negative space on this foreground tree. And I can also use this damp brush to kind of push and pull some of these softer oranges into some of the nearby yellows that are still damp from the previous layer. But I don't want to go so far that I completely end up covering up some of those vibrant yellows. So I want to be mindful that sometimes the additional textures need to come on a second pass. While things are still damp, I'm now going to grab that cadmium red mixture. I am just going to really wipe off the excess because I don't want an overwhelming amount of red. And I just want to do a little splash here and there. And I feel like this cadmium red isn't as vibrant as I need it. So I'm going to be adding more pigment. I'm going to be wiping my brush off really well. And then I'm going to return to my painting. And since I wipe my brush off really well, the paint, when I dab it into a wet area, it's not bleeding as far. And that's going to help me at least make sure that I maintain some of these other really pretty colors that I've established. Now I can rinse my brush, tap my sponge to get rid of the large water droplets, and using a mildly damp brush, I can kind of push and pull these reds around on my wet surface, and I can kind of give their outside shape just a little bit more texture. I'm going to give those trees a little bit of time to kind of dry off so that it doesn't get overworked. Meanwhile, I'm going to use some water, and I'm going to add some water to the field off in the distance. So I'm staying below my mountains. If I go over top of the actual tree trunks, I don't even worry about it because they're going to be so dark later on. Now I'm going to bring this water down past the tree trunks, past the trail, to the area where I have a lot of shrubs next to the creek. So I'm going to start off with adding some of my cadmium yellow to the distant field. I am being mindful of my shapes. Try not to just, create symmetry or flat edges. I'm trying to embrace texture. Now, since I'm working in such a small area, when I use a really large brush, it tends to want to drop a very large quantity of paint. So for that reason, I'm going to switch to my number 6 round so I don't drop as much paint into my painting. But if you're working on a larger scale, that's not going to make a big difference. You can just stick with your larger brush. So I'm using my cadmium orange now that I've added some of that blue to, so it's a little bit more on the earthy side. So I'm just getting some color in the back field. I'm going to grab some of that vibrant red, and I'm going to be selective with it, but I'm going to add just a splash of red here and there. Now I'm going to grab some of that brown I made up, and I want to kind of give a shadow on the underside of the tree. So it's going to kind of cut through this field near the tree trunks. Now I'm going to move to the opposite side of the trail and continue with my textures. I'm going to use some of the orange. And I'm going to use quite a bit of brown, especially on the bottom of this area. And I'm going to be bringing in some of those olive greens. So I'm going to rinse my brush and remove the excess water from my brush. And I'm just going to use this barely damp brush to kind of push and pull my colors around to again create some different textures and try and make some of my shapes a little bit more interesting to look at, because this is just a base. And I want to blend the very bottom edge because it will eventually meet with water, and I'm not ready for that to be a hard edge yet. So I'm just using some clean water to soften that bottom edge while I kind of work things out. Now for the trail, I'm going to use a watered down brown. So I'm pulling some of that brown aside, adding quite a bit of water. I want it to be lighter than the other values in the area. And I'm using kind of horizontal lines with this brown glaze to imply a trail through here. Now I'm going to give this area in the foreground some time to dry a bit more so my colors don't bleed as much. And I'm going to return to my trees and just start building on some of that texture. I have some areas in my trees where I've accidentally dropped some water just from rinsing my brush, so I'm just going to pick those up a bit. And I'm going to go into these trees with my brown, and I'm just going to darken up some of these areas so it looks like gaps in all the leaves. So I'm holding my brush more vertical, and I'm kind of just doing a glorified scribble. I want there to be quite a few shadows on the underside of all the leaves in this tree, so I'm making them a bit darker. I'm always trying to be mindful of the outside shape that I'm creating and trying to make that a little bit more organic. Now before some of those colors dry, I'm going to rinse my brush and tap my sponge. I'm going to grab a little bit of red, but I'm going to water it down a bit so I can kind of create a glaze. And I'm going to use this red to kind of expand some sides of the shadows. So I'm being very mindful of my negative space, trying not to just completely fill it in and go on autopilot. So I'm keeping a light touch. It's really easy to just darken everything up and then you lose your highlights. So I have to often pause and remind myself, hold on, take your time, don't rush it. Now that I have some shadows in that foreground tree, I want to add some shadows to the second tree in the middle. So I'm going to come through with my dark browns, add some shadows on the left side, imply that there are some gaps. I'm going to bring in some dark green as well, because maybe we can see a little bit of some green trees through this middle tree. And I'm going to rinse my brush and get rid of the excess water on my brush. And with this damp brush, I'm going to continue to kind of blend some of these colors on my paper. And I'm just working with modifying their shape a bit more. Sometimes I'm using the damp brush to soften some of the edges and colors so it's a little bit less intense. My field is still damp, so when I come in contact with it, I'm creating little blooms, and I'm okay with that. This is definitely a subject where I want to embrace having textures. I can blend some of those browns if I feel like it's necessary, as long as I'm being mindful of my brights and not completely covering those up. So I'm going to check on the status of my foreground, and everything is still very, very damp. So rather than overworking that area too much, I'm going to hop over to the right side of my landscape. I'm going to continue with some of my vibrant field colors, and I'm just painting directly onto dry paper at the moment. I'm just using a little bit of water to kind of expand some of these vibrant colors down and around. I can touch in some other fall colors if I feel it's necessary. But as I get to this foreground on the bottom right corner, I'm going to choose to be adding more olive color. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now, while this area on the right is kind of drying and doing its thing, I'm going to return to my trees and just add some additional texture. So some areas I want to have, minimal texture. Others I'm going to be a little heavier handed. So I'm just using some of my cadmium yellow and my number 6 round. And I'm just going to give a little bit of texture in some select areas of my yellow so it doesn't look too flat. I'm going to use a little bit of that orange. I'm going to water it down so it's more of a glaze, so it's not so dark. And using this watered down orange, I can continue adding some texture, but it just won't make me lose all of my vibrancy. So by watering down my color, it's just going to ensure I don't go too dark, because it's so easy to do. I'm going to return to the field below the trees. Things are still cold to the touch, so I may get some bloom textures, but I'm going to be okay with that because I just want to embrace the textures and have some fun. So I'm going to grab some of that brown mixture. I'm going to make sure to wipe off the excess, and I'm going to hold my brush more vertical, and I want to just imply that in the shadow beneath the tree that there is some grass-like textures. So I'm being feather light with my brush, just letting the very end of it touch. And I'm just trying to kind of get some varying shapes and sizes to indicate some grasses here. And I want these shadows to kind of come right over to the base of the tree. I do want to imply some shadows underneath the distant tree behind. So I'm going to get some browns in there. Now in the foreground here, I would like to get some additional color, but I want some of my foreground shrubbery and the colors I use to end up being reflected into the water. So I need to just be mindful of that and I'm going to add some blue here so I can get that effect. So I'm going to mix up some Cerulean Blue. And I'm going to start off with creating my shrub textures, and then I'll be bringing some moisture in right next to it to create a little bit more of a reflected look. So I'm going to start with some of my more vibrant oranges. And you could use a sponge or other brushes for texture. It doesn't have to be a round brush. I'm just trying to vary the type of texture that I have in here. In order to make that trail pop out, I want to make sure that I do have some darker colors up next to it. So whether they're grasses or bushes, whatever it might be. Whenever this olive green comes in contact with an orange, it's just going to make another variation of a brown. And I'm okay with that. I'm going to grab some cadmium yellow just to add a little bit more color value next to that trail. Maybe have some of these yellows going in between a bit. Notice the amount of negative space I'm maintaining between. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let some of this begin to dry before I start blending things. That way we have some areas that are just heavier in texture than others. And then right in this bottom left corner, I'm going to be adding some browns to darken that up a bit. So while that texture kind of begins to dry, and it's not done yet, I'm just soaking up some of the puddling so it dries a little faster. I'm now going to use some clean water in the area of the creek. The area on the right has dried, so I have the ability to just go right up to it with my water if I'd like. I'm giving a little bit more space. So I'm adding some of that cerulean blue just in the area of the creek. I can dab a sponge and get that excess paint and water off my brush, so it's easier to kind of move this color around the shoreline on the right side that is dry. If you have areas of blues that are kind of going up on the shoreline, you just dab with a paper towel. but we're going to be bringing more color and contrast into a lot of these areas, so I wouldn't really worry about it a whole lot. So while these blues are in here, I'm going to get some Ultramarine blue, which will be a little darker. And I'm going to bring that closer to the shoreline on the left. Now, while those blues are still wet, I'm going to grab some of that dark brown, and I can add a little bit of Payne's gray to it to darken it up even further. So it's almost close to a black. And right along the shoreline here, I'm going to get some good dark values. And then as I start to recede, I'm going to switch to my lighter brown so the colors aren't as intense as we move away from the foreground. So while that's all wet, I'm going to use just a damp brush, and I'm now going to do some blending and changing of some of the shapes that are in the texture here. I can rinse my brush occasionally so everything doesn't become one color. I'm going to grab some dark greens. Just add some dark greens to the bottom here in a few areas. But I like how that shrubbery color is kind of bleeding into those wet blues, and it's just kind of making it really fun. If some of the bleeding is going a little further than you'd like, you can always dab with a paper towel to stop it. And you can just go in with your softer blues again and resaturate if you'd like. So I can just come right back in here to reestablish some of the blues. I'm just going to use some damp water just to kind of soften some of the transition between the blue and dry green. And I can just build on that a little later. All right, we're getting to a place where we need to start thinking about our sky and background. Now, the reason I did not paint the sky on background is because there's a lot of blues involved, and I wanted my foreground yellows and oranges to remain vibrant. So I wanted to paint the background sky after I've achieved the texture in the trees and the shape in the trees that I wanted. That way I don't have to worry about accidentally running into some of my blues. So now that my trees are dry, I can bring water into the sky. I can even extend the water right over top of my mountains, but I'll just paint those in a second pass. But now I can use some of my Cerulean Blue and add some sky color. Now your sky is always going to be more vibrant and a darker blue towards the top. And then as you come down closer to the horizon line, your sky is going to lighten in color. So right now I'm just getting some vibrant blues of both ultramarine and cerulean at the top. I'm now going to rinse my brush and I'm going to use a clean, damp brush to kind of push these blues up towards the edge of my trees. But notice the texture I'm trying to maintain around the edges. I'm not just smoothing it out. If there's some whites showing, I don't even mind. I just want to create a fun, interesting edge to look at. I don't want to smooth it out and make it perfect. So I'm trying to get some interesting ins and outs between the sky color and my tree. I can continue with some of this darker blue. And on top of that real soft yellow, I can imply some gaps in the leaves. I'm just trying to make the shapes I use varying in size. Now, as I come down on my sky, I can just re-rinse my brush so I continue to work with a clean, damp brush. And I can pull some of the blue from my sky down into the wet water that is there closer to my mountains and horizon line, just to give it a tint of blue without being real dark. I can kind of imply some cloud-like texture if I want. I can even just drop in some clean water on top of my wet dark blues to kind of push some of those dark blues out and imply some clouds. It's really just up to you. Just kind of have fun. Just be watching the shine on your paper to make sure you get out in time before things begin to dry. So right now I feel like I'm happy with that side of the sky, so I need to kind of give some attention to the area down below. Now I want to make sure that my sky color that is over here beneath my trees is equal in value and color to the right. So I want to be aware of that. So I'm going to really make sure I have a watered down blue that I feel like is similar to what I see on the right side. And I'm just going to turn my paper a little bit so it's easier. I'm actually going to work upside down a little bit because I don't want to rest my hand in wet paint. So this time I'm painting wet on dry, and that's because I don't have a real huge area I'm working with. So I'm just starting on one side with my blue, trying to keep that edge up against the tree textured and interesting. If I go right over top of the tree trunk, I don't even worry about it. That's going to be much darker when the time comes. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. All right, I'm going to let that soft blue dry there. And while it's drying, I'm just going to continue to add some texture to the foreground. The background, I'm going to try to do, less texture just so since it's not really the focal point, but you never know where they're going to end up. So I'm going to check here. Things are a bit cold yet, but my field and trail are dry, so I can at least work over there and have a little bit more control. So I'm going to use this watered down brown, so kind of a glaze, to create some texture along this trail. On the back side of the trail, I want some more vibrant yellows just to make it pop. So I'm going to come in and really just add some vibrant yellows on that back side, so that trail kind of stands forward more. All right, I'm definitely at a stage where I have a lot of areas that are wet. I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so I can bring in the final detail. Now that I've dried everything, I can add some of the background mountains. So some of them that are more in the foreground, I want to be a little bit more vibrant. So I'm going to be working with just a little bit of the Cerulean Blue and a little bit of Cadmium Red. So I'm making kind of a grayish purple color. And I just want to go across these mountains here, and my color is still very much washed out. And I'm just doing a glaze to kind of establish where they're at. So while that dries, I'm going to hop over to this opposite side, and I'm going to continue adding that glaze to some of the rear mountains. Wherever I overlap that glaze on top of the foreground field, I can just kind of tap with a paper towel just to soften that. And I need to give those mountains some space to dry before I do an additional layers. So I'm going to return to the foreground and start pushing some details here. I'm going to use a darker brown that I've added some black to, or even Payne's gray. And I'm going to come right where the bottom of this little shoreline comes in contact with the creek. I'm just darkening that up a bit. As I work my way back, I want my color to be softer, so I'm going to use a more watered down version. But in the foreground, I want some vibrant color there. And I'm going to extend some of these darks in the foreground up into the shoreline. And I'm going to grab some of that dark green to kind of create some shrubs right along the bottom there that may be in shadow. So I'm just kind of creating that contrast that I need there for the water. I can get some of that darker ultramarine blue. I'm going to water that down a bit so it's not too dark. And I can just give a hint of maybe some water movement coming off that left shore. Any texture I create in the creek, though, I'm kind of keeping it rather horizontal. And then as I go back, it's kind of less and less detail. And my colors are a little bit more washed out. I'm now going to come to the foreground on the right side. And I want to get more texture in here. So I can kind of change up the different colors I'm using. So sometimes I'm kind of creating a shrub-like texture. Sometimes I'm implying grass blades. Adding some yellow and just doing some blending. As we get further back, we want less detail and less vibrant color. So I'm going to return to the left here. And I think I'm going to use more of the oranges. I'm going to check in on those mountains, see if they are dry yet. They still need a little bit more time, so I'm going to work a little bit more on the field. So I have that dark brown on my brush, and I just want to kind of create a textured back edge to the trail as it meets up with the field. I can extend some of this texture onto the trail itself if I want. I just don't want to darken it up too much. So sometimes just using a little bit of water to blend some areas keeps it nice and bright. I need to darken up the shoreline on the back side of the creek. So I'm going to bring in some of that lighter brown. I'm making the top edge nice and textured. And I want this right shore to look like some of that grass is just kind of cut across here. So I'm not going to be bringing these light browns too far to the right. I can now go through the back field and add just a little bit more washed out color, but just to break it up. I can add a watered down kind of blue-green tree to be off in the distance as well, or tree line, a group of trees. Now that the mountains are dry, I'm going to go behind them with a darker blue and indicate a second set of mountains. So I'm just going to start up against my trees, identify, approximately how tall I want them to be. And I'm going to use this same blue to create a second set of mountains on the left side. I'm going to add some reds to the shoreline. Just a little bit. Add some variety. All right, so I think I'm at a place where I need to hit this with the blow dryer again before I continue with details. Now, one of the techniques I always really enjoy in landscapes is being able to lift out some of the highlights to brighten things up. So I'm using a square stiff brush that is wet, but I've made sure there's no water droplets on the metal portion of the brush. And in any areas where I just want a little bit more brightness, I'm just going to come in and lift out some color. And when I see the color starting to move, I'll use my clean paper towel to pick it up. So I'm just coming in and deciding maybe I want a little bit more brightness here. And notice how I'm changing the direction I'm holding my brush so that I don't just lift out a big circle. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. So any areas where I feel like, I just need a little bit more brightness in there. Even where the trees meet with the sky, especially in the lower area where their sky is a light blue, you can soften some of those edges using a damp brush to make it look just a little bit more subtle where the colors meet up. It just gives a little bit more of a softer effect. You can do the same thing in the area of the different shrubs and ground cover. You can come in and use the corner of your brush to lift out some highlights and to create some texture. Now there are some tools in watercolors that are called scrubbing brushes, and they have very, very stiff bristles and are great for this. But since I'm working in such a small scale for this demonstration, I don't really have the space for their wide width. So I'm just deciding to kind of come in with just the corner of a stiff square brush to lift some things out. And you're going to find some colors lift much easier than others, and that's just because some may be staining pigments versus others that might be non-staining. So I do want my background to be just a little softer. So I'm letting the water kind of do the work where I can give just a little bit more of a soft glow to some of the background elements. I can lift out some whites in the creek if I want, using my square brush. I can lift out some parts of the trail if I felt like it got a little too dark. So I'm really just letting the water do the work. The bristles of my brush are not bending much, so be aware of that. It's not about muscling. And I just use the corner once in a while to kind of lift out parts in the shrub area. If there's areas where you feel like you have just a little bit too much texture, you can just soften it a bit. Using a little bit of water, you can blend some of that texture out. Now that everything's dry, I'm going to use dark brown to establish my tree trunk. I'm going to start with the tree trunk on the left. And the color I have on my brush right now is a little lighter than I would prefer, but it's going to allow me time to kind of decide where I want my trunk and branches, and then allow me to add some darker shadows in the areas where I've been playing. Now that I have established where I want everything to be, now I can go in while things are wet, and I can push my dart
I would like a large branch to cut across to the right. And try to keep my branchies relatively even and wet. When I'm making the smaller branches, I like to occasionally just pick up my branch or pick up my brush as if it's hopping over a leaf, and then I continue painting the branch on the opposite side. I'm going to continue to use this dark brown just to kind of push some of the values on the ground. I like to do just a series of little dots and dashes just to add some texture. I'm going to get some more vibrant red. And I'm not going to put too many of them before I begin blending. So I just want to get some additional vibrant red in these foreground trees. And I have my number 6 round with just a little bit of water on it. I'm just trying to add a little bit more shadow. And these reds I'm going to leave really nice and vibrant. I'm going to get some of my oranges and a little bit of that cadmium yellow so making bright. I want some of these greens in your foreground to be a little bit more vibrant. Shoreline where the water bends in the river. So if I want definition with that creek, you really take the moment to push the contrast of the elements that are nearby. If I want, I can even darken up a little bit in that tree line in the distance. I just don't want too much detail back there. But otherwise, this is just a fun little landscape that you can practice with. Take it as far as you'd like, but I'm sure if you do a few different variations of it, you're going to get multiple results and you're going to slowly learn what you personally enjoy adding to landscape and the textures that you enjoy, and just kind of play, have fun. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think of this tutorial. I'd love to see what kind of little landscapes you've all come up with. Just remind yourselves to be playful. Don't take it too seriously. Vary your textures and shapes, and just watch your contrast. And I hope to paint with you soon. Talk to you later.